welcome to this BCS IT Leaders Forum event. At this event, we plan to inform you of the progress that's been made by our Software Risk and Resilience Working Group. Many people have been involved, from members of the BCS to others with an interest in this field. Our aim with all of our working groups is to do just that, and in doing so, influence others both inside and outside of the BCS. Jonathan, if you could change the slide, please. Thank you. So these are our current working groups, and our objectives for 2023 are to inform, involve, and influence. And all of our working groups that you can see there do that. Well, and if you want to get involved in anything that we're doing, please email us at itleaders@bcs.org.uk. So internationally, Jonathan, could you change the slide, please? These are troubled times, and this evening we're throwing another pebble into the water. We're doing this because we think this particular pebble could cause not just a ripple, but something of a tsunami. Next slide, please. Right. So the world's ever more dependent on software, such that a software failure in one system could create a cascade effect through the many interconnected systems, and so affect millions of people's lives. Hence the Software Risk and Resilience Working Group. Gillian Ringland, Professor Ed Steinmuller, John Hall are here tonight to inform us about the work of the group and what they think the next step should be. Needless to say, this is already influencing others. Our colleagues in the BCS, the National Preparedness Commission, and perhaps government itself. And now it's your chance for some involvement and the opportunity to influence the outcome and next steps as well. An evening truly aligned then with all three of our objectives. And with that, I'll hand you over to Ed to introduce the topic. Ed.
Well, actually, we're going to have Jill speak first.
Oh, fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Jill.
Thank you. This picture is really quite simple. What it says is that down in the bottom half, we've got a representation of phase one, which was about defining the issue. And that had really two legs to it. What is the impact of software failures? And what are the trends in software and system supply? And we also noted that UK developed software was a very small proportion of the operational software in the UK or affecting UK PLC. So since we were concerned that we needed to look at it from the outside, what's the impact of software failures, we went and looked. And Ed will talk later about our modified success in being able to scope the impact of software failures, except to understand that it's big and it's worth doing this stuff because it's big. And it's big and it is growing. So we're now at the end of phase one, the end of 2022, and we've got software failures starting to impact productivity, and it's going to get worse. So the next phase is, so who is going to do what? And there are really two halves to this. One is improving resilience. That is, this stuff breaks. How can organizations get better at restarting? Or even how can software organizations be better structured such that it doesn't completely fail? And then there is the management of risk. How can organizations improve their management of risk? So phase two is about who's going to do what and how they're going to do it. And this is the purpose of our discussion today. The next slide is Ed. And
Right, so
Ed's going to do the definitions.
right, so I'm going to talk about the logic of the project so far, which the phase one part of the project. how we've proceeded and what we've come up with. So we began by circumscribing the two keywords, risk and resilience. And these are the definitions that we're using here, that risk is the factor that could result in future negative consequence, and some further detail about that. But the key point here is the notion that there are a variety of possible factors, and currently one of the things that's really dominating the discussion is cyber risk, the risk stemming from bad actors and security concerns, and to the extent that intrinsic problems with software, intrinsic errors such as those suggested on the earlier slide that David was presenting, exist and are somewhat overshadowed by the cyber security aspects. That being said, if there are intrinsic failures in software, what is an appropriate approach to improving resilience? And that involves recovering, as Jill was suggesting, in ways that don't destroy or corrupt data, and ideally to preserve some degree of functionality and operational service. And the Financial Conduct Authority, who's been particularly concerned with this, has a similar definition. Next, Jonathan.
Hello, everyone. Sorry to be late.
So when we talk about software risk, the idea is that it's everywhere. It is a utility, but it's not managed as such. And as Jill observed earlier, most organizations rely on their operation on software that's outside their control. And one of the major causes of software outages in the past has been power outages, but now software and IT configuration and network issues are overtaking power outages as major causes of IT service breaches. These, as I've already suggested, major shocks are almost inevitable. Only their location and timing are unknown, and the causes and mitigations of software failure are not well understood. There are many different pieces to this puzzle, and it hasn't been put together in a entirely coherent way, particularly at the level of organizational management. And that's one of the primary things that we've found in the working group, is that many of the technical people may be well aware, but not necessarily others. Jill, you might want to mute because you may be contributing to the echo.
I can do that.
So, so I am not only an IT guy. My whole career has been devoted to studying information and communication technologies, but I'm also an economist. So I was interested in what we could say about the economic effects of breaches. And one of the first things we found was that these economic effects are not routinely quantified or reported by UK organizations. Yet we know the social costs of software failure could be catastrophic. And let's illustrate that point. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So what these software failures amount to? Well, we know that they come from defects in coding, the incorporation of or use of legacy software. It's both ways, both the legacy software that your own organization continues to use, but also when organizations are merged, combined, acquired, and so forth, with them often comes legacy software. Fixes for known vulnerabilities that aren't implemented, assumptions on the security of commercial off-the-shelf software. Many would assume that they were in fact resilient, risk-free, but they're not. The problem of transactions exceeding throughput limits, which is particularly true of the overload. Of course, in the cybersecurity, this is the denial of service attack mode that's one of the most common. The trends, technological trends, are not only causes but accelerators. There's an increasing volume of software. The Internet of Things is becoming the Internet of Everything. Software is throughout, and the persistent practice of maximizing the speed to market in software development is largely at odds with considerations of service breaches and maintenance issues. And social trends are also increasing software risks. That the integration of software in businesses in the process of digitalization makes common component spread effects of any malfunctions against many across many parts of the organization. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So when we come to estimate the cost, the first thing we recognize is it's neither the suppliers of the software nor the organizations that are using it to deliver services that bear the principal brunt of the cost. The people that bear the principal costs are the users that rely upon these services. And because they are many, and each one of them experiences some loss, it's actually a challenge to estimate the collective costs imposed by software failures. Nevertheless, software failures may have widespread, long-lasting consequences on the service providing organizations in terms of lost business and reputation, stress on or loss of staff, and these accompany the user costs. And finally, software suppliers do bear some of the costs because they need to fix the causes of the failure, and they, as a result, may have associated reputational costs, but have little or no reason to count the cost to either level of customers, either the service providers or the ultimate users of software. So there's a disconnect in the incentives governing the management of risk in software and the consequences of software failure. I mentioned previously that UK-specific data on software failures and their cost to society do not exist. And one of the reasons for that is the reluctance to disclose software failures because of organization sensitivity, reputation, and the like. Nevertheless, when data doesn't exist, if one is quantitatively inclined, one attempts to make an estimate, and the report, the ideas, policy ideas piece that we came up with contains an appendix which has a detailed methodology for estimating costs. The next slide. And brackets them between a fairly tight study of what would be the costs of GPS failure for 5 days in the UK, including navigation systems, and what the annual costs estimated for the UK of road traffic accidents. It is certainly true that the software failure annual cost approaches the cost of road traffic accidents. And this, of course, is not putting a particularly high value on fatalities and other costs of road traffic accidents. We have to recognize software failures can also cause fatalities. So on the order of 12 to 14 billion pounds sterling per year is a conservative estimate of these costs. Next slide, Jonathan. So I conclude with what often happens when confronted with a sort of aggregate number, which is, after all, estimated, even if I'm reasonably confident of the means of estimate. It's the most tangible thing is to talk about specific examples. So the three examples on this slide, the first one concerns something that happened in December of 2014 when the computer system providing high-level air traffic information over England and Wales failed. So for some 5.5 hours, all departures were stopped from throughout European airports that were planning to route through affected UK airspace. And it was estimated that 1,900 flights and 230,000 passengers were affected. This is what we mean by large-scale social impact. The cause of the failure was a system shutdown due to more terminals becoming active than the system configuration accepted. A configuration error. Military traffic had been added into the system without corresponding updates to the software. A second example is from an example where an automation control system was embedded in 261 different manufactured products and then revealed to be vulnerable to access by hackers. Okay, this suggests there is an interaction between cybersecurity issues and the intrinsic reliability of software issues. The latest version of this same software was found to have similar or worse issues, including the ability to execute arbitrary uploaded code, which is a absolutely bog standard means to hack into systems by malevolent actors. And the second example, of course, is focusing on the very rapid and widespread, because software is replicated in many different places, use the same code. Well, if that code is problematic, then the error is replicated across a lot of organizations, a lot of products, and it's a fundamental issue. And the last, a reflection on slightly over 1,000 people that worked from home during the pandemic, estimated that it had cost the economy some 60 billion pounds per year. And most, one quarter of that was described as arising from technical difficulties that occurred very or fairly often. Similarly, during the same period, data delays led to chaos for city traders, and in one instance caused pricing errors in the city. Assets are always changing in value very rapidly, and so just a few minutes of interruption causes massive chaos in the ability to conclude transactions and maintain pricing accuracy. So each of these is a major consequence of the intrinsic problems or the interaction between intrinsic problems in software and security or cybersecurity issues. So that's sort of the range and scope of activity that we've done in attempting to outline the case for awareness of the significance of software risk and to illustrate it's an issue that deserves greater attention, priority, but of course, just raising awareness isn't sufficient. We also want to proceed to think about what might be done to improve the situation. And I'll hand over to Jill to talk a bit about where we might go now with phase 2.
I wasn't sure whether John might take this, given that I'm vocally challenged at the moment.
Well, John is vocally, not quite as vocally challenged as you are, Jill, but I appreciate the fact that there is code going around, so I'm happy to take this. It will be a different message to yours, so perhaps you need to contribute where and when. Yes, so as you can see, I've come down to the basement of my organization, where we keep all the software together with all the dials, together with all the things that keep the organization running. Those things should be spinning, and they're not because there's a software fault. So if this Zoom call goes down, it's not my fault, it's software. But we have, so I do appreciate really the depth and the difficulties that software cause. I spent my life looking at software and the problems of trying to make it better. I realized that many of those years have been wasted, but that's neither here nor there. One of the more valuable things that happens recently in my life around this area is Jill and Ed's roundtable that was held at BCS with the National Preparedness Commission, with a very knowledgeable audience, a really great plenary session on reducing the impact of software failures on the UK's economy and society. There was a very lively discussion. Everybody was represented, from banks to formal verifiers of software. All points of view were heard. The main conclusions: more people and organizations need to be aware of the actual and potential impact of software failures. One of the difficulties in the current society is that computing is seen as a sort of plumbing issue. Things work because of software. Generally, they tend to work really quite well because of software. We can do things, we can explore conversations we would never have had, we can explore technologies that we would never have had. And so people see it as a sort of plumbing, and the only reason you worry about your plumbing is when you get a big bulge in your ceiling with the impending deluge. It's the same with software. That impending deluge is always there. We need to be more aware of it. Beginning with the work of Bev Littlewood in the 1970s or 1980s, could have been the 1980s. I don't want to say how old he is. I don't know how old he is. Bev Littlewood was a really gifted statistician, looking at software and the way that software fails. And he was the first to realize that software fails in different ways to the way hardware does. Hardware degrades, software doesn't. Hardware can have inherent faults, but it tends to be where that causes hardware to fail. Software has inherent faults. It doesn't deteriorate over time, but depending on context, depending on inputs, depending on outputs, those failures can be revealed. Those faults are tangible, but they come from the intangible. and software obeys different rules to hardware systems. And I think I've covered the third point in my first point as well. So software has become a utility, is in very wide use and more subject to failure. Everything that we touch these days, even the microphone that I'm speaking into, has software in it. I'm just going to turn it up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's really good.
Mm.
So the recommendations. So BCS is a computing society. Of course it is. National Preparedness Commission has a much wider remit than software. And there was some helpful differences in the approaches that they were thinking to take. They came from people on the software side thinking about software failures, thinking about appropriate measures that would come to deal with the consequences of software failures, and thinking about how people in organizations such as IT leaders, the remit of the ITLF, the IT Leaders Forum, should work with managers responsible for the delivery of service and products to understand the organization's exposure to software failure. That there was a need for policymakers to be made aware of the implications for the fact that software is different. It raises new risks. People are not generally equipped to deal with those risks. And old methods of dealing with risk do not necessarily apply to software. And that IT professionals should create an accessible set of guidelines for organizations to improve their resilience of their digital systems. This could take many forms. One form that was suggested was development of standards for service safety, for service continuity, for instance. And I know that some stuff is going on in Europe at this time that will affect the UK, and that may well have knock-on effects in this area. But there is a need to raise awareness. There is a need to get people talking about this issue. We have a great history of dealing constructively and effectively with software failure. Y2K is one aspect of this. The reason that it wasn't an absolute disaster is because we dealt with it beforehand. Convincing people that it wasn't just us talking up the software industry is a different thing. So we have to be careful in that aspect of this. But that comes through talking with the right people, with the right language at the right time. We have to get this into boardrooms. So we need to talk the language of business. The boards that I come into contact with through my research work do have issues around their knowledge of digital. So translating the issues that we find here into language that the board would understand is of incredible importance. And I recommend this work to you as very valuable, as something that can be a competitive edge to the UK economy. But I'd like to disagree with something Ed said, which is that working from home is a cost. Working from home is actually a delight. And just think of all those miles that people haven't spent sitting on the motorway waiting for the traffic lights to change. How much it's saved in that area. But anyway, sorry, back to Jill.
I think the study was of people who were being plummeted without preparedness into having to work from home. And, you know, I know what a disaster it was because I was with a social enterprise and we had a network of about 50 people. And of those, maybe 20 had usable IT. It was bad news. So
that was just my little hobby horse. Sorry about that.
Yeah, understood. I work from home too. And most of the time it works. So what we thought now would be that open it up to the floor to consider really 4 questions under probably not so much the first bullet as the second, third, and fourth bullets. So the questions apply to how IT leaders could work with managers responsible for service delivery. How could IT professionals work with policymakers and standards bodies? How can IT professionals create an accessible set of guidelines for organizations to improve the resilience of their digital systems? And we're looking really for 4 things. Where are the low-hanging fruit? Are there areas where we just don't know and it needs more research? Who else do we need to work with to progress this? And what would be a realistic sort of target for 2023? So with those questions in mind, would anybody like to unmute and venture, please?
It may already have happened, but I don't know, Michael, Andy. So here, scrolling down quickly, Derek. So if before you unmute, just after you mute, if you could just say who you are and which organization, that would help me very much in picking up where your contributions are coming from.
No problem. My name is Michael Warman. I work for Welsh Water as a business analyst. I'm also the branch secretary of the South Wales branch. I attended your AGM recently, so I thought I'd listen into one of your working groups to see how you manage them. And I was just wondering whether you were aware of the SolarWinds hack that it certainly impacted the water industry recently. Jonathan's nodding. Thank you, Jonathan. I was hoping somebody else would have been aware of it.
No.
Tell us about it, Michael. Tell us about it.
It was a really clever hack. They managed to get into the system and they managed to put the code in the automatic updates. And SolarWinds is what we use for managing a lot of our network. And so when a company went in and did the right thing, they were told to update their software. They went in, they downloaded the updated software. They actually downloaded the bug as part of the patch.
Yeah,
Because if I remember right, Jonathan, it was because the password was generic. Everybody used the same password to access it.
That's right, yeah. You weren't the only one. Well, that wasn't the only organizer. Well,
Industry, yeah.
Well, everybody updated. Whoever took the update had the issue.
We were lucky we didn't, but there was an awful lot of stress. We're quite lucky. Our new chief technology officer is very keen on cybersecurity from that area and information security. We also have, we're unusual in that we have 3 types of technology. So we have digital websites, browsers, payment systems, customer databases. We have the standard IT that everybody else has, but we also have operational technology in that we have technology specifically designed for managing water pumping stations, water processing, wastewater treatment works. Got a system called SCADA, and we're as an organization we are very heavily reliant on IT.
Yeah, but it's a good thing you raised, Michael, isn't that? You know, as more and more people perhaps reduce the size of their IT organizations, because more and more of it is coming supported by third parties, or even, you know, in SaaS services or cloud services, is the knowledge drops within the organization, and, you know, people perhaps assume that these companies that develop this software test it and make sure it's ready and fit for purpose, and therefore don't no longer test it themselves as an organization.
Well, I was wondering, as part of one of the recommendations, potentially working more closely with the cybersecurity specialist group. Well, I think they're called information security, because they will have some insights on some. There was a talk I went to recently, and there was a list of software vendors, and it was a list of all the known bugs that hadn't been closed. I forgot the name of the software, but apparently there's a website you can go to. You can see all the bugs in a particular kind of software.
Yeah. That might be a good question to ask people, is how many organizations have the capability to test software that is provided to them via software vendors? Or do they just install it and hope for the best?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question. Sorry.
can I just say, yes, the Information Security Specialist Group has followed our work, contributed to both reports. And the group manager was hoping to be at the round table, but couldn't make it at the last minute. So, yes, and we, I mean, the ITLF is very, very big, and it's quite difficult to get the ITLF as such to cooperate with the specialist group, which is typically 20 or 30 people. So it'll probably be joint presentations that will be the way of working together. John.
You mentioned information security, which brings up ISO 27000. 27000 is a large family of standards. Perhaps the best known are 27001, 27002, which describes the controls. 27001 describes the process of building an information security management system. 27002 describes controls. Amongst those controls are controls on software for its secure development. I can see a reason to mimic that sort of standard, where we look at risks to business, to service provision, to service security, identify those risks in terms of some terms that would resonate with the board, and then produce a mapping between those terms and the controls, which wouldn't be uniquely for software, of course, but the vast majority would be for software. And so in that way, produce something of use to organizations, large and small, for controlling the risks that they have to their service and products through software issues. I do see this as a risk management issue.
Is it a case that we just need to be able to speak the same language as the business leaders and translate what the IT risk is to a business? So if you were to take one of the common frameworks and say, for example, a typical breach of IT equipment would impact all your users with a laptop, and a breach on a mobile phone would potentially impact everyone that's using a tablet and a company issued mobile phone. And if that company mobile phone isn't secure, it could leach. And then you just refer to Data Protection Act. You could be leaching customer data.
Yeah.
Or they could access customer data.
I think that's one possible approach. I don't think InfoSec has been particularly successful in talking the language of the board. My experience in organizations is that confidentiality is understood. Integrity and availability are not understood. And so you've got one tendency, which is to lock down an organization, whereas availability is ignored, and the effect of availability should be to open up an organization to balance the tendency to lock down. So we need to be careful about the nomenclature that we choose. But yes, I mean, I think your suggestion is sensible, that we need to talk the language of the board.
Unmute. Can I ask another question? Are there any obvious things that are quite simple that would start to unblock either the accessible set of guidelines? Is there one in existence, for instance, that could be brought up to date, or is the structure so different in the last few years that a lot of these things need to be reworked? What's the thinking on that? Where should IT professionals start on that, an accessible set of guidelines to improve the resilience of their digital systems? Mhm.
Can I say something? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear Stephen.
Okay. I just want to add to the complexity of that question, because I'm attracted to the idea of a work plan to create an accessible set of guidelines parallel to the oodles of guidelines there now are for cybersecurity. You're right, don't seem to be practical guidelines for organizations with regard to resilience, but I want to revisit the first, and I believe far more important, bullet point of our recommendations. And you know that one of the things that attracted me to this working group when we originally formed it and set up its work plan, as it were, was the fact that nobody else that I knew of seemed to be focusing on the consequences, on the economic impact of the effects of software failures. And as Ed so eloquently outlined again, those impacts and effects are more often than not visited on people who are innocent victims. They're not anyone that's been involved in developing the software, procuring it, using it. They're just merely the victims of the software failure. And that's what this group, I think, should be focusing on, is the huge consequences to groups of users and possibly the country and the economy as a whole. And if you take Michael's illustration of his water companies that have Internet of Things in equipment that runs water supply, you know, a bug in that equipment could result in a bug in the water, I may stretch the analogy, and result in severe sickness of hundreds of thousands of people, for example. That may be quite a stretch, but the point is, that's really the issue I think we need to have as a very strong idea for a work plan going forward. I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm just saying, please don't let's lose sight of that. There's an awful lot of work already being done and has been done on all the other factors, trying to improve resilience, improve security, building better software in the first place, detecting error, being able to recover when it fails, all the impact on the organizations with the software, using the software, developing it, but very little has ever been done on addressing what are now going to be escalating dramatic and national level catastrophic consequences of software failure on the innocent victims that are the victims of software failure. So that just adds to the complexity of your question without answering it. I'm sorry.
Before Paul comes in, can I just make a quick comment on that, which is yes and. Yes, the consequences of software failures are significant, high, and there's a big bundle of work to make us aware of the consequences. That BCS can't do on its own, and so hence the National Preparedness Commission, and John Hall is also introducing us to the Digital Policy Alliance so that we are working with policymakers. If I'm likely to be one of the people trying to work with policymakers, I would feel a lot better if we weren't saying, yeah, terrible. If I could also say, yeah, it's terrible. However, there are some concrete things that people can do. And we've got the BCS is beavering away back at home, looking at those and trying to get an improvement in standards. Okay. I think you have to do both, because if you just talk about the consequences, you know, you're out there going, oh, the software industry is terrible. John Hall had a nice cartoon with that, where you took, the cartoon basically said, if you talk to an engineer who builds bridges, he'll tell you about how marvelous the bridges are. If you talk to a metals technician, he'll talk about how marvelous the diagnostics are. If you talk to a software engineer, he'll tell you how terrible software is. We're in danger of shooting ourselves in the foot unless we can actually say some concrete positives, as well as focusing on the consequences of software failure. You're absolutely right. Agreement. Paul, you wanted to say something.
Thanks, Jill. So Paul Williams, I'm an independent resilience consultant, also a commissioner on the National Preparedness Commission, here by special invitation from Jill, because I attended the round table. I've got a number of observations. I'm not sure if they'll move the discussion on, and some of them resonate actually with the points that have just previously been made. And at risk of stating the bleeding obvious, it's really important, I think, to be clear what problem we're trying to fix here, or more specifically, what outcome we think we could reasonably produce from this work. I was struck by the comment just a moment ago that this is a risk management issue. And it's worth reflecting on the difference between risk management and resilience, I think. And that goes to my prior point. If we're worried about this from a risk management point of view, then I think we're interested in increasing the reliability, reducing the failure of software. If we're interested in the resilience of this, resilience requires you to acknowledge that things will fail. And I think it's inevitable that however much you did on the former from a risk management point of view, some level of failure is inevitable in the context of software. And that brings me to the point that I strongly agree with from Stephen, which is then managing the consequences of failure is where resilience is really built. And the way we've approached that in the financial services industry, which is ostensibly where my background is from, the way you articulate that for the board is particularly important, because you articulate it to the board not in the context of the risk necessarily, but in the consequence of the risk crystallizing and what the resilience implications of that are. And we've required, in my time at the Bank of England, we've required firms to do that through the lens of the business services that they care most about, which is different from their business continuity plan. So there's a number of decision points in there around whether this is a risk management issue, whether this is a software standards issue focused on improving the reliability and reducing the likelihood of software failing, or whether this is a resilience issue, which is focused on absorbing the consequences of that and getting people to focus better on how you articulate that through the lens of business, through business service and consequence management. And they're obviously quite different things.
Thank you, Paul. That's the point about this working group. It was risk and resilience, and I joined it and was excited by it when Jill first proposed it at the AGM of the ITLF a year ago, because for once we were going to look at the resilience qua looking at and trying to come up with some kind of protocols to deal with, make compensation for even the results of inevitable software failure. That's the point. We start from the point that it will be inevitable. Yes, we can still go on and educate and inform about how to make it less likely, but it will be inevitable. And it's that dealing with the consequences. So we're talking about transferring the modeling about nonlinear systems, sensitivity analysis, how a small change can result in a huge impact. Highly nonlinear systems, that's what software systems are generally. They're highly nonlinear. A small bug can create a huge consequence, both operationally and financially. And that's where I think I would like to see, I'm not saying, Jill, that we don't attend to the other ones, of course, but that's where we're different, I hope. With ITLF Risk and Resilience Working Group, we're hoping to come out with some kind of learning points, some kind of model, some kind of protocols, draft though they may be, tentative though they may be, that we can try and get across, certainly to policymakers, but also to business organizations who are, of course, quite used to carrying out modeling and doing forward projections of their business. They have analysts, they have mathematicians, they have mathematical modelers, they have economists, they have statisticians working in their marketing, in their sales, in their financial management, in their industrial processes, and their procurement. So they're not unfamiliar with the science, the management science behind what we're talking about here. And it's trying to get that over to understand now your management science is wholly dependent on software. You don't necessarily understand it, so we've got to do all the other good things we've been talking about, but also we need to see you building into your models the fact you've got a non-linear thing which you are totally dependent on. It's called software. Now go away and figure what's going to be the consequences of that and how are you going to deal with it. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just saying that is what I see as the distinctive question we are now posing and hoping to find some way of finding a route to answering. I'm not saying we'll find the answers, but let's at least make sure we've got a big route defined, and that's what we want to do.
I'm really struggling with this software at the moment. Can somebody help me? I've just sent the comic that Jill mentioned. It's from XKCD, which is generally an excellent, very funny, very insightful thing. It's in the chat if you want to see it.
Thanks, John. Yeah, what are you having troubles with, John?
Oh, just generally computers.
Right, that's fair enough.
Yeah, I didn't quite hear what John's problem was. Usually his chat doesn't come over as having many problems, I have to say. Always very, very confident
but
and smiling.
It's
I love it.
you know how it is with the swan swimming in the on the lake. There's a small submarine beneath me, and it's really dragging me down. So, but we're here to talk about software failure, not John's failure. So.
So let me come back to one of the earlier ideas that we presented, which was that what the working group has done so far is to work on a phase one, which is essentially a scoping of the issues of risk and resilience, identifying the priority that should be assigned to examining the issues, but stopping short of making a specific set of proposals as to what to do next. And that was defined as phase two of the working group effort. And I think all the comments that people have made have been very helpful to illustrate the importance of proceeding to a phase two, where one makes some very concrete proposals, not only about identifying the risk exposure and the significance and importance of dealing with the consequences through improving resilience, but also exactly how one should proceed. In the workshop, the roundtable that we had, one of the more cogent questions was, could you provide a guide to retrofitting an organization to become more resilient? And I think that goes to a key point. And we know that larger organizations do think about resilience in terms of service continuity, and they do realize the dependence upon software. But there are many other organizations in the national infrastructure, in small and medium-sized enterprises, in other parts of the economy that have yet to recognize the priority of these issues for service continuity and exactly what can be done to reduce the negative consequences of the failures that will inevitably occur. And so that's really pointing us to the second phase of the project, and how what people we need to have in the room to address that second phase, which is not only IT professionals and not only BCS type people, but a broader range of people that are able to speak of this in terms of service continuity and consequences, as Stephen outlined, but also what needs to be done in order to improve across a wide range of different types of organizations the response to the issue.
So the question you're posing, Ed, is against one or other of these bullets, are there some obvious other communities to work with? Is that basic?
Yes, indeed. We have in these bullets, we have focused very much on IT leaders and professionals, Really the question is, for example, in the fourth bullet, is it realistic to expect IT professionals to create an accessible, and I focus on the word accessible there, set of guidelines for organizations to improve the resilience of their digital systems? Even that formulation of the bullet is not in terms of service continuity or in terms of consequences for for service continuity or business health. It's in terms of IT systems, in terms of digital systems. That already suggests that because we are IT professionals, we're tending to see it through the lens of digital security and digital resilience, whereas organizations are going to want to see it in terms of the accessibility, reliability, continuity of the services they're offering, and all the implications that has for productivity and profitability and effectiveness of the organization.
I wonder whether Paul would like to come in here, since his area was resilience at the Bank of England.
Yeah, I mean, the way we've approached it, and this is that the more you move to the resilience conversation, I think the more you move away from the specifics of software. Stephen's point about the non-linear nature of software and the way it can fail, totally accepted. But there are other aspects of organizational systems which are also non-linear in nature. And if you want to talk about resilience and setting up an organizational capability, then I think you have to move away somewhat from the symptoms or the risks that you're seeing and describe the characteristics of the organization and the characteristics it needs to exhibit to be resilient, and to do that in a way that the business can engage with, that allows the business top down to start taking an interest in the topic and to ask intelligent questions across some quite complex technical areas. The way we approached that for financial services was, and it sounds deceptively simple, is to require financial services firms to identify their important business services. That's not the same as building a business continuity plan. If you imagine putting the CEO up against a wall and saying, what can you cut off now to survive this afternoon? You've got a very different list of what they care about compared to what's in the business continuity plan. And then define beyond risk management and beyond probability, acknowledging that failure is inevitable, what is the tolerance that you can absorb failure within relative to those important business services, and then work back through testing and mapping and severe but plausible scenarios to validate all of that. So you're building in an intrinsic level of absorptive capacity relative to the business service outcome that the business cares most about, not necessarily the systems that contribute to those service outcomes, but focusing on the service outcomes instead. That is a deceptively simple policy intervention, but actually driving some quite profoundly complex discussions with firms around how they build technology systems, how they manage third parties, consequences of third parties, how they do risk management, what constitutes a severe but plausible scenario that should be managed in the first place.
I'm very attracted to that, Paul. I'm not familiar with it, having looked into. There's an awful feedback from somewhere, a party going on somewhere. I don't know anyone else can hear it. It's not here anyway. Well, that's better now. You turn your mic off. Maybe somebody's having a party behind you there. You should be joining it soon. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'm very attracted to that. I'm wondering if the established models and protocols which you clearly had from the Bank of England, if they're not proprietary or if they're very good practice, we could be at the working group be more informed about them and see whether we can remodel them for businesses generally, or at least in a few critical national infrastructure type organizations, and do a mapping that's amenable to them and their business parameters. That would be a very good place to start, I would suggest.
When I was at the bank, I did write a paper with a colleague of mine for the National Preparedness Commission, which took the essence of the policy, but put it in language for a non-financial services audience. It's on the National Preparedness Commission website, but I can dig that link out and send it on to you for circulation. If I find it now, I'll put it in the chat.
That would be great. Thank you, Paul. Additionally, we did think that one of the big gaps was the lack of the sort of thinking that the financial services sector has put in place in the infrastructure sector. You know, whether that's electricity, water, as Michael was saying earlier, or whether it's health. So we did think that thinking about how these things might be applied in the infrastructure sectors would be a really important thing to do, because there are sectors where there's less expertise, but the leverage is enormous. Coming back to Stephen's point about consequences, choosing where to look because of the consequences rather than the technical interest.
There's a whole separate presentation I could give on the diagnostic that we did that was never published. So it's somewhat personal and subjective in nature around why financial services needed that intervention in the first place. And chief among it was that executives don't care about hygiene factors, i.e. those things that the organisation has to do, but if they do them well, doesn't create a competitive advantage, but if they do them poorly, has the propensity to kill them. They have a tendency to delegate these kinds of things into risk frameworks and to risk functions, whilst they focus on what they see as more important business imperatives instead. And that leads to a delegation or abdication of responsibility. And as the complexity of the digital systems that infrastructure tends to rely upon and society relies upon more broadly, that approach is not okay anymore. And businesses need to instinctively take into the way the business is run what the consequences of digital systems failure will be on the services and the consumers of the services that they provide. And that was the essence of the intervention, really, which was how do you, rather than standards which address symptoms, principles and outcomes address the cause or the root behavior. And we tried to describe what's the minimum level of prescription that we could provide that had the potential to drive the maximum amount of beneficial change within the way that firms thought about non-financial resilience, and that's what these principles try and address. And I'm looking for the article now.
It's that old adage about you have routine protocols for hygiene. I like that word. And your successes that you just don't notice that they're there. I mean, it's the toilet lid syndrome. You leave the toilet lid up. I'm not talking about the seat, ladies. I'm talking about the lid. Leave the toilet lid up and you think, well, does it really matter whether it's up or down? You realize why you put it down when you drop your smartphone down the toilet. But that may never happen, and it may only happen to 1 in a million people. But in a way, that's why you always put the toilet lid down, because the consequences of it happening that 1 in a million time could be huge. Not that there's a general hygiene problem with it being up or down. There may be a slight hygiene problem as well, but it's fairly marginal. So I'm very attracted to that. If you've got a way of expressing that we can map over to as a work plan to going forward on this issue of consequences of developing protocols for making businesses aware. You're right, from the business parameter point of view, not from the IT people are almost incidental to this, because they basically get into the door by just accepting that there will be software failures. Fine, you've told us that, now go away. Now we've got to develop a protocol of what the heck do we do about this? It's almost not an IT issue. That's the fascinating part about it.
I think Michael's had his hand up for a while.
Only a little while. Thanks very much. I was just wondering, from a policymaker's perspective, if we, I don't like the word target, but if we aim to engage with policymakers we know that have had problems with software failures, I'm thinking specifically the NHS recently. If we say financial services do this really well because they have a framework, or they have principles and policies and they have expected outcomes. The second bullet point, IT leaders working with managers. One of the questions I often ask is, how will you deliver the service if the system goes down? If we build you a billing system and the billing system goes down for whatever reason, could be a network issue, could be anything, could be any reason, how would you, what's your disaster recovery plan? And is that acceptable? And is it, I suppose that's risk mitigation, isn't it? Depends how long it's down, depends how many traffics, depends if it's close to a billing period in that particular example. I'm wondering whether that's an approach that would be relatively easy. If you say, look, most of the issues that you've had with NHS is that you're using really old kit and it's unsecure. It doesn't appear that you're following CIS, or you're misusing the CIS controls of securing your assets, securing your boundaries, securing your network. And that's led to an IT failure. This IT failure happened to be because it was hacked, but that could have been because the interconnectedness of all these systems, you're heavily reliant on IT for almost everything that you do. I'm not sure that a lot of business users, I mean, IT is almost invisible. When it works, nobody notices it. Just a thought.
I've made the point in the past in my other roles, and I think that's emphasising the point you've just made. My observation from 25 years building and running global technology infrastructure organisations is that people tend to care about infrastructure under only two circumstances. My point around hygiene again, when it's broken or when you want them to spend money on it, a bit like the analogy of the plumbing and the bulge in the ceiling earlier. And you've got to find a way of getting people to care about it. Ironically, to echoing a point that's previously made, the way you get them to care about it is not to talk about it, but to talk about the consequences of it when it fails, and get them focused in that direction instead. And this is back to my earlier point. I think a number of points that have touched on the same thing, which is in addressing the risk and the issue that we see, we may actually end up talking about something else rather than making a direct intervention relative to the topic at hand, but focusing on the consequences of the issue crystallizing instead, and how organisations think about that. An example I used at the round table, but I think building on your point, Michael, around asking business leaders to think about what would be the implications if the system failed. In financial services, what the policy has done is forced banks, for example, to think about ATMs and the availability of ATMs. Of course, no one really cares about the availability of ATMs. What they really care about is access to cash, and getting the business to think about the business outcome in the event that ATMs are not available and how they would deal with that, at least in severe but plausible scenarios, drives an entirely different thought process in the business from a top-down business outcome point of view than a bottom-up risk management. How do you stop ATMs going down in the first place does.
I think, again, Paul, that's an excellent framing of the issue. The bottom up and the top down. The bottom up is from the IT, and let's do all we can to prevent it happening and mitigate it happening, recovering from it when it happens. But hang on, yes, but it is inevitably going to happen. So then let's look from the top down about what do we put in place for the management of the business, for protocols, for procedures, for people, for standby people. I mean, it's akin to being prepared for a pandemic, actually, preparing a health service for a pandemic. I mean, we don't start discussing the health service because it has other bigger problems, but yes, we try. Well, of course, that shows the paradox. It's not a health service, it's a sickness service. If it was really a health service, government would be putting in at the bottom up, putting in provisions to try and keep people healthy in the first place, which they do a little about, but not nearly as much as they spend on fixing people when they get unhealthy. But then a pandemic comes along. How prepared are you for the modeling that you should have done, that we now can do because we've had one? What is a good question. What is being done to prepare us for the next one? I leave that question on the table. I actually have to leave because I'm actually going to be meeting and nibbling with some policymakers at the Party Group and I, which is invited to a Christmas reception at the House of Lords. And I must sadly depart. Jill, I already told you, and it's been a fantastic discussion, and I wish you well and look forward to the next stages, and be happy to continue to input to it.
If you're going to get a peerage, if you're going to get a peerage, Stephen, you better do it now because the House of Lords is on its way out.
Yes, hurry.
Thank you, Stephen.
Let's get there before it closes. I just wanted to put in something really quick, which in fact was something Paul brought up. I think not at the round table, but when he was reviewing the draft report. And that was introducing this concept of normal accident theory, which was introduced in the nuclear industry. And it basically says, if systems are tightly connected and complex, they will fail, full stop. And having a phrase like that seems to me something that's politically really strong, because you can say, we're not saying software is different. In this particular instance, we're saying that all systems that are tightly coupled and complex are likely to follow normal accident theory. And this is what the nuclear industry and various other industries have been working on for years. So why don't we just realize that, fellas? And that for me was such a breakthrough. So thank you, Paul, for that one. Maybe I'm simple-minded. Having a phrase like that makes me feel easy in a way.
No, I agree with you, Jill. And if we've done anything in reality, what I've put the link in the comments box. Actually, from a financial services point of view, there's no new thinking in there really. All we've done is simplify how the problem is looked at and created some principles and concepts that may be more accessible for leaders of organizations to get hold of, rather than the complexity that comes from the bottom-up risk management approach. And acknowledging simple concepts like normal accident theory, i.e. failure is inevitable, now how are you going to deal with it, moves you from the fundamentals of risk management, which is essentially a probabilistic discipline, into a more deterministic approach, which is, okay, what is it we need to protect and against which scenarios, and work back from that. And then how are we going to protect ourselves against that?
If I've given the impression that my understanding of risk is naive, I don't think it is. It does work from the needs of the end user group to encode the risks. So hopefully I haven't given that impression.
I think that's a really useful place to stop, in that we've sort of got to a position where we're saying actually getting some vocabulary that simplifies it is important. There isn't it in common usage at the moment. Where is it? Let's go find it. And that, I think, is a really important step. I don't know whether anybody would like to vote against that summary or for that summary. Back to Jonathan to decide how he wants to take it from here.
No, I think if you've got your summary of sort of some key actions to take up, Jill, that's great. And obviously you've got the recording as well, if there's anything else that comes from that. And I guess people can also reach out to you if there's any other questions or observations they want to share after the meeting. And again,
well, in fact, if we go on the next slide.
Yeah. And you got the contacts, yeah. All right, there you go.
The proposed next steps is going to, I think we've added something to this, which is develop a simplified, not exactly simplified, but more appropriate terminology. So there's another bullet point on proposed next step is discuss appropriate terminology for moving this forward. So that is a real wow for me. I'm not sure how other people feel. We were thinking that in order to keep the impetus going, we'd probably try to hold a conference in about May next year to collate and promote results. And then, as Jonathan said, the contacts are all on the last slide, and please be in touch.
I guess, yeah, if anybody's got any further questions they want to ask now, obviously feel free to raise them. But equally, if you think of something afterwards, then yeah, contacts are here for you to follow up on. Okay.
Any last points, please?
Right. All right. I'd just like to say, Jill, Ed, thanks for your for running this session and giving the people the opportunity to hear what you've been doing in the working group. It's always great to see some of the results so far of these working sessions, and yeah, look forward to seeing some more progress in 2023. So, and thanks for everybody else for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.